how can automakers and suppliers make the switch to electric vehicles? My guest today is Arun Kumar, Managing Director of the Automotive and Industrial Practice of AlixPartners. Hello, Arun.
Hi, how are you? Glad
Good,
to be
and
here.
thank you for being with me today. So based on AlixPartners' latest global automotive outlook, what are the biggest challenges that you see confronting automakers today?
Well, I think I'd say the primary one for automakers right now is that switch to from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. I mean, the amount of transformation that the automakers have to go through from the consumer side to the product development within their own organization and the supply chain is just humongous. It's almost like the kind of transformation we're talking about is the last 5 years is almost equal to what we have seen in the last 100 years. So
Mhm.
that's a level of change that need to go through in an environment where you're not going to be seeing a lot of profits from selling these vehicles in the market.
Yeah, I think you talk in the report about the variable cost penalty, which is significant. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think for electric vehicles, the battery is probably the biggest cost component at the moment. It's based on a lot of different chemistries. There is the costs are coming down, but still at the moment, when you think about the cost per kilowatt hour, it's pretty high compared to what it should be compared to an internal combustion engine. So what this does is, if you have a 70 kilowatt hour battery, with $150 per kilowatt hour to $160 per kilowatt hour, the cost of a battery in a vehicle itself becomes pretty high, anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000. So I think this puts a lot of it puts a constraint for the automakers, because you can't really take cost out in other components, because you got to have a seat, you got to have tires, you got to have a steering wheel. Where else do you take cost out? So that is why we believe that we're going to see a profit desert, where the profits on a per vehicle basis on the variable margins side would be lower compared to what a typical internal combustion engines would cost.
It'll be interesting to see the various sourcing decisions that automakers make. In the case of Tesla, for instance, they're making their own batteries. And I'm wondering if some of the more name brand traditional automaker names might be outsourcing that, or will they also approach that? I mean, that's a cost and availability issue. What do you think they'll be doing in that area?
Yeah, I think there's different models that different automakers are pursuing. You've got the Tesla model of a lot of vertical integration, tightly controlling the supply. And on the other end, you got a lot of other automakers, the traditional automakers, much more focused on having a joint venture and close tie with the battery manufacturers, but they're not tying themselves to a specific battery manufacturers, but kind of expanding that so that they can get the supply that they need as they ramp up their production for electric vehicles.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, it all depends on how much capital that you have to allocate to production of batteries. I think a lot of traditional automakers are taking the route where they want to use a partner who would make that investments. On the flip side, what the automakers are going to give them is the assurance of demand of batteries, so that if a supplier like LG or SK, they're putting that capacity down for batteries, they know they've got a ready demand available they can tap into. So I think that's kind of the lot of joint ventures that you see in the market as we speak, both from supply assurance standpoint and also getting a decent return on the investment.
There's also the short-term and long-term problems we've been hearing about that automakers are having with respect to other types of components and raw materials. Of course, we know about the semiconductor shortage right now, which is plaguing automakers. There are the rare earth materials that go into these batteries and other aspects of the cars. Do you see that as being a potential problem going forward?
Well, I think if you were to ask me this question 3-4 years ago, I think that was a huge concern. Especially the rare earth magnets, which China has a significant advantage over other countries in being able to mine that. But I think what you're going to see is that a lot of these automakers are settling down on a permanent magnet motor technology, which is probably the more advanced compared to the other types of technologies out there, whether it's AC induction or for electric motors specifically. So you're going to see But I think you're also going to see that, as the demand picks up for electric vehicles and more suppliers involved in the mining of these rare earth materials, you're going to see supply increase as well. So what used to be a big concern 3-4 years ago, I think just the natural evolution of more people getting involved in developing those mines and raw materials, I don't think we'll see a huge problem as we speak today.
Do you think that automakers going forward are going to have to be more involved in end of life and reverse logistics and recycling aspects of the cars? In other words, the batteries themselves, the rare earth materials that go into cars that are being retired in a way that they never did before?
Yeah, I think you already see that with internal combustion engines. A lot of these alternator cores or things that are valuable, you can recycle those. They're already doing that in the aftermarket. I think you're absolutely right. We're going to see OEM interest to recycle batteries, take some of at least have. Probably they won't invest their own capital into doing these things because they want to make sure that they direct the capital to areas where they get the better return. So they're probably going to have a joint venture or close partnership with suppliers on the battery recycling specifically, or rare earth material recycling, so that they can take advantage of the assurance of supply, rather than having to mine every time for new material. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. Again, a lot of that depends on how fast you see the adoption curve for electric vehicles. Every OEM has got some projection internally in terms of what they think the adoption curve is going to be. If that adoption curve in reality is faster than what they expected, then you're going to see a lot of these moves for the OEMs to ensure that they've got supply assurance. If it's slower, then some of these recycling and of materials might not be a greater focus for them.
Well, some of them are pretty ambitious about that adoption curve, looking at maybe 2030 as being the time at which several of these automakers go exclusively to the production of electric vehicles, and maybe even before that. Now, I'm wondering, is that a function of the automakers making those decisions and then having the consuming public adjust to what's available to them on the market, or are they based that on actual consumer demand? Is that what's going to drive their adoption of electric vehicles? Chicken or egg? Which what's going to drive what?
Well, I think there's also other factors as well. Things like a lot of the cities and countries trying to ban internal combustion engines. So you're seeing that coming in 2030, 2035. So, for example, we did an assessment that if you took all the announcements by major countries and cities that are trying to ban internal combustion engines, and the automakers that are willing to switch entirely to electric, by 2030, you're going to see about 35% of the vehicles being sold, new vehicles being sold, to be battery electrics. Versus if that didn't happen, it would be only 25%. So it's a 10 percentage point increase in adoption if everybody, if people ban internal combustion engines and OEMs move exclusively to a battery electric. So there's that piece of that, but also with the electrics, what this lets you do is that it opens up opportunities for a lot of automakers to gain market share. So if you're first to the market, and if you're the only few brands that are out there in the market, then you have a chance that as consumers think about electrics, those are the brands and the models that people will consider, because you've got a smaller pool. So if I'm a domestic automaker, I've got 15-16% market share. The question becomes, if I'm first to the market with a lot of these different products in the different segments, would I get an advantage by gaining some market share? So there's a lot of calculations that are going on in their mind, rather than it's purely this consumer. It is a little bit of build it, they'll come and approach. But that is always the case, the chicken and egg thing.
New technology always faces that. And of course, this isn't exactly new technology. We've had electric vehicles for a while. There have been stops and starts in getting them to be accepted on the market. A number of them even predate Tesla. My question, I guess, is why now? Why is this the inflection point where we're actually seeing the actual conversion to electric vehicles?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing now is a confluence of many different factors that are working towards this inflection point. Battery costs, if you look at 5, 6 years ago, if you looked at the forecast 5, 6 years ago, people not, if I had told somebody that the cost per kilowatt hour would be close to $100, people would be laughing at me because nobody thought, that we would ever get to that $100 per kilowatt hour. We are. Technology, scale, all of those things, the investments that are going into batteries, really driving that benefit. So cost is coming down. Regulations are another piece I talked about before. A lot of politicians and a lot of countries are really rethinking this whole climate bargain, I would say, where I'm getting the benefit of transportation, but at what cost? I think that's also driving that. It's a confluence of factors. And the technology itself is actually much more mature. If you go back to the 1990s, I don't think the technology was as mature as it is today, especially from a battery technology standpoint.
Yeah.
Electric motors were fine, or other components, electronics were fine. But when it comes to battery technology, I don't think you've had the same maturity of the technology that we have today. So all of these factors, and then infrastructure is a big piece, right? I mean, when I had if you had a vehicle, in the 90s, where would you charge it? You have to come home and charge it. It limits your ability to move around as freely as you could do today. So there's a lot of confluence of factors that are driving towards this inflection point.
Arun Kumar of AlixPartners, thank you for sharing with us the insights of the Global Automotive Outlook, the latest one from AlixPartners, and talking about this big change we're finally now seeing in the switch to electric vehicles in the automotive market. Thank you very much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and thanks for having me on the call today.